So we are at session 4 of an 8-week series, an examination of race, ethnicity, and othering in American religious traditions. And I was exceedingly excited anticipating this session because it's my area of passion. So I'm looking forward to learning from Dr. Robinson Moore and Dr. Sadler, two colleagues and now two friends. I just met Julia today and I'm thrilled to deepen our relationship and learning. For those of you who aren't getting the emails, we have Louise Clark. Louise, you want to raise your hand? So she's here. If anybody isn't getting an email, please let her know so you can be part of our advocacy network. Next week, we'll be back out here for media, and the portrayal of race will be in McKnight Auditorium. So we'll be in a different site. So we'll have media and the portrayal of race next week. And the final week, on November 16th, we'll be back at Queens. We have many more weeks, but in the final week, we'll decide on our advocacy agenda. And then you'll get emails every week that tell you how we're going to move issues forward. So the topic of race and religion has always been of interest to me. And my dad's good friend was this man named Kivy Kaplan. And I used to grow up playing in Kivy Kaplan's house. And Kivy Kaplan was a Jewish man who was the first Jewish president of the NAACP from 1966 to 1975. So I was born in 66 and I grew up with him as the president of the NAACP. And I grew up learning about the positive moments in Black-Jewish relations. I grew up learning about Rosenwald schools. This man, Julius Rosenwald, built over 5,000 schools for educating African-American children. I grew up learning about Freedom Summer and the Jewish Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, who were with James Chaney, setting up freedom schools in the South and registering African-Americans to vote when the three of them were murdered because of their work. I grew up being proud of Jewish refugee scholars who fled the Holocaust and came to America and taught at historic Black colleges. I grew up seeing images of Blacks and Jews marching together in Selma, Alabama. And I grew up with this picture in my mind, and it was with Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. marching together in Selma. And Martin Luther King, Abraham Joshua Heschel was a professor of theology at the seminary on the Upper West Side of New York, and he took leave to march in Selma. And he was asked about that experience, and he said that he felt his legs were praying. Yet over the years, things got rocky in the world of Black-Jewish relations. There's been times of affinity and times of distance, and we hope that we can build stronger bridges together. That is our goal. And so later in life, when I learned that people were using the Bible to oppress, especially in terms of race, but in any way, it was deeply devastating to me. It was much later in life when I heard some of the teachings that Dr. Moore and Dr. Sadler will share. But they're really important that we know these teachings and understand these teachings, and we want to hear from them not only what religion has done to oppress, but what religion can do to dismantle oppression and dismantle racism. So we want to hear our painful past, but we also want to hear how we can create a better future. Dr. Julia Robinson Moore got her PhD from Michigan State University. She joined the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Charlotte in 2005. She teaches courses in African American religion, religions of the African diaspora, and racial violence in America. Her first book, titled Race, Religion, and the Pulpit, Reverend Robert L. Bradby and the Making of Urban Detroit, explores how Bradby's church became the catalyst for economic empowerment, community building, and the formation of an urban African-American working class in Detroit. Her second book project, Overcoming Race and the Faith, Black Presbyterians in the New South City of Charlotte, speaks to the complexities of Black and white race relations in the New South through the sacred context of the Presbyterian Church. And Dr. Rodney Sadler received his PhD from Duke University. His teaching experience includes courses in biblical languages, Old and New Testament interpretation, wisdom literature in the Bible, the history and religion of ancient Israel, in African American Biblical Interpretation. His first authored book, Can a Cushite Change His Skin? An Examination of Race, Ethnicity, and Othering in the Hebrew Bible, was published in 2005. He frequently lectures within the church and community on race in the Bible, African American biblical interpretation, the image of Jesus, biblical archaeology, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was the managing editor of the African American Devotional Bible. He is president of MACMIN, our esteemed interfaith organization in Charlotte, and he's vice chair of the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice. I think there's hardly a week that goes by that we are not doing some social justice work together. He lives the work of social justice virtually every hour of every day. He is a scholar, an activist, and a friend. So we give a round of applause. And Dr. Sattler will begin.
Good evening. How are we all doing today? Good, good, good. It's a blessing to be able to be here today with you. I want to say thank you so much to Rabbi Judy for this opportunity, and I just want to say that as you started, you talked about Kibbe, last name, I'm sorry again.
Kibbe Kaplan.
Kaplan. I want you to know that the NAACP convention this year, Kibbe Kaplan's name was raised by Rabbi Joshua Pessner, who made a point of talking about the historic relationship between African Americans and the Jewish community through the NAACP. So that story continues to inspire people to this day. So thank you for that. So I'm charged to talk a little bit today about the way that the Bible has played a role, and the way that we interpret the Bible has played a role in race relations in America. I want to start by saying that, in essence, the concept of race is a spurious idea, to be sure. It really develops about the time when, I like to say, people from Europe began to set out and explore the world and wanted a reason to justify taking people from land and taking land from people. Race is fundamentally an economic idea more than a scientific idea. And it's an idea that does not necessarily lend itself to easy interpretation. We often think about race as an idea that has persisted forever. But the thing is that the way that we construct race in America, race as tied to phenotypical presentation, color of your skin, the shape of your eyes, your nose, your hair, and race tied to somatic type, what your body looks like, is a relatively recent idea. There have been, of course, people that recognized and noted these differences before. But the fact that we've put them together in such a way as to justify a hierarchical relationship between people of different types, that we could correlate issues of character, intelligence, sexuality, criminality with what you look like on the outside, is an incredibly recent phenomenon. More to this point, too, one of the things that we found in recent years, way back in 1960, Ashley Montagu writes a book called Race, Man's Most Dangerous Myth. Even back then, people were starting to recognize that the concept had no anthropological merit. It was imposed upon people, it did not seem to fit. More recently, geneticists have examined this and come to the conclusion that, I like to use these statements, there's more genetic difference between two groups of gorillas on one mountain in Africa than between every human being on the planet. That the greatest physical differences are often between people who are genetically incredibly closely related. So, for example, Africans on the continent and Europeans on the continent are incredibly closely related genetically, even though by phenotype we might think them quite different. In essence, the concept of race is a spurious one to begin with. Science was utilized when people started developing notions of taxonomy. Science was utilized to frame this as a way of thinking. But ultimately, science did not satisfy the needs of most people. In part, it didn't satisfy them because there was another major competing call for meaning, a basis of meaning in the Western world, that being Christianity and the scriptures that we associate as the Holy Bible. People started to say that if race was going to be justified, legitimate as a factor, we had to correlate it with Scripture as well. And in essence, passages that had had a long history of interpretation were reread in particular ways on these shores in the Americas. Around about the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, we start to see new interpretations of old texts that had been in flux over time, but had generally had a common thesis, began to be reinterpreted in ways that added a racial dimension to them. A number of these texts were particularly potent for their use in this discourse. And I want to talk about a few of those as we start our conversation today. Hopefully we'll get to, most of this won't be me talking at you, but will be a conversation that we'll have together. But let me start off with one of the ones that was most troubling. And actually, could I get one of you to read, I'm going to pick up you, Kelly. Could you read this for me, please? Genesis 4, verses 9 through 15. And this is the story about, we all know the story probably, about Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel. There is the aftermath of that narrative is what leads itself to this interpretation. Please. Yeah.
Okay. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done?" "Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him.
Good, thank you. So one of the first passages I want to lift up is this passage right here. It's seemingly innocuous. If we were to analyze it in a class, I would probably point out a number of difficulties with this passage. One of which is that if you look at it carefully, the curse that's put on Cain is a curse that's actually on the ground, not on his person. Later on, when he talks about the mark on Cain, this seems to be a mark of what? Protection. Protecting him from violence from outside. Well, around about the latter part of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, this passage was reinterpreted. And the mark of Cain was utilized as a framework to talk about the fact that Cain was cursed. The curse of Cain became the mark of Cain. And what do you think the mark of Cain was correlated with? Black skin. So the blackness of Cain's skin was deemed the mark of Cain. And this passage that talks about Cain and this relationship of a curse was utilized to frame the notion of the oppression of African Americans as legitimate. They're cursed in this instance. Usually when you talk about a curse in this way too, it is a curse by God that's placed on them. So it has greater merit over time. Another one of the most significant passages used in this way was this passage, Genesis chapter 10, which forms the basis of something that's called the Table of Nations. Now, on its surface, it seems to be fairly innocuous. It is an ethnographic description of how the peoples of the earth were populated in the aftermath of the deluge, in the aftermath of the flood. The three sons of Noah go out and repopulate the earth. And this is a description of those people. In essence, it's a large patronymic, i.e. a list of names from fathers that goes down through the various generations. But this patronymic was interesting because there are three sons. So, during the slavery period, pro-slavery advocates, in essence, looked at the three sons of Noah, correlated it with the notion that there are three races, African, Asian, and European. And therefore, the three sons of Noah become the antecedents of the various races on the earth. This passage goes on, and there's a lot I could say about this particularly. There's some correlation between some groups in different places. All of them are technically African groups. They're all on the African continent, save maybe the sons of Japheth, and we could talk a little bit about that. But the most interesting thing about this is it was meant to try to say that all of the people of the earth were related, that we all came from the same family. And this passage was turned on its head to suggest that there was a fundamental ontological difference between human beings, and that this is the basis of that difference. In essence, race developed in part, it was correlated with this passage, and it was used. And you say, okay, well, so race exists, what's the problem with that? Not so much of a problem. Well, if you read one chapter back, you find a passage that makes the notion of one of these groups being racially defined as African wholly problematic. The son of Ham was described as the ancestor to many of the nations that we usually talk about when we talk about Africa. Egypt, so Somalia, Libya, all of these nations in this region, Kush, which is Nubia, or the current nation of the Sudan. So we have this passage here, though, in Genesis chapter 9, which becomes the most pernicious, the most disturbing, the most troubling in its use. Now, I'll say this, if I'm teaching a class on the Hebrew Bible, first thing I'd say is that this is an incredibly complex narrative that demonstrates signs of redaction. At one point in time, it looks like this exists between three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which is stated in the text. At another point, it looks like the three sons are actually Shem, Japheth, and Canaan. The Shem, Japheth, and Canaan narrative look like the older narrative. The Shem, Ham, and Japheth narrative seems to be a later version of the narrative that was made to make it correlate with the Genesis 10 passage. Let me just read this to you. Forgive me for having to read this whole thing too. So Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan. Now note this strange addition. This occurs at least twice, maybe three times in the narrative, to identify Ham in relationship to Canaan. Saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Seeing the nakedness, I could spend a whole day talking to you about what this could be. And tells his brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward, covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his who? Youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, and lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." If I were also telling you this, I would say this story serves an important purpose in the meta-narrative of Scripture. This is one of the legitimating ideologies for why the Canaanites should lose the land, and why the sons of Shem, eventually the people of Israel, should inherit the land. This narrative, in essence, says that there's a fundamental moral flaw in their eponymous ancestor, and therefore justifies their loss of the land, their enslavement to the people of Israel later. The text, though, was reread in the 19th century to, in essence, suggest that the curse was not a curse on the people of Canaan, but the curse, how have we learned it? The curse of who? Curse of Ham. It became the curse of Ham. Read through Genesis 10, the lens suggests that Ham is the ancestor to all African peoples. Therefore, it's a curse on black peoples. And it says they're supposed to be slaves to whom? Supposed to be slaves to Shem and to Japheth. Now, Japheth, they would read through the lens of Genesis chapter 10 to suggest is the ancestor of the European peoples. Therefore, this suggests blacks are to be subject to whites in slavery. Now, they also, even though Shem, in theory, would be read as the ancestor of the quote-unquote Asiatic peoples in this thesis, he's also read as the ancestor of white peoples. So it becomes a double curse of everyone, of the people of Africa subjected to the the whims of the people of Europe. Now, you say, well, this is an odd passage. It doesn't seem like it would have much of an impact on people in the way that they think. And you couldn't be more wrong than that. In essence, round about the 1820, this becomes a basic text that is used to help develop laws in America. Used to help legitimate slavery and say why the system of the slaveocracy is not only divinely inspired, but it is appropriate to perpetuate, and that to remove this would be an offense to God. So, for example, in the state of Virginia in 1820, this becomes the basis of laws that are put in place to legitimate slavery. In 1818, South Carolina Senator William Smith makes this statement: Ham sinned against his God and against his father, for which Noah the inspired patriarch cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. This very African race are the descendants of Canaan and have been the slaves of various nations and are still expiating in bondage the curse upon themselves and their progenitors. Well, he's not the only person that uses this. Another famous use of this was by a northern Presbyterian preacher, I believe he's Presbyterian, Josiah Priest. And he talks about the curse as the curse on the Hamites. And this is what he says the curse defines. He said that Hamites are exceedingly prone to acts of ferocity and cruelty involving murder, war, butcheries, and even cannibalism, including beastly lust and lasciviousness in its worst feature, going beyond the force of these passions as possessed in common by the other races of men. The word signifies deceit, dishonesty, treachery, low-mindedness, and malice. What a group of horrors are here, couched in the word Ham, all agreeing in the most surprising manner with the color of Ham's skin, as well as with his real character as a man, during his own life, as well as with that of his race, even now. Seemingly innocuous passage utilized to prop up a racialized system in a very pernicious way. He also said something about white people I think we should attend to. Whites, the sons of Japheth, are the ancestor of the fair white man, the progenitor of a race who would have filled the world with their glory, for the white man and the white woman are paramount in all the improvements of the earth. Well, at least he didn't have gender bias. In addition, I want to mention one other person and give you a quote from one other person. This is a fellow that is particularly troubling to me because he's a professor from my seminary, Union Theological Seminary, the oldest seminary in the South. In the aftermath of the Civil War, a guy named Robert Louis Dabney, who was Stonewall Jackson's chaplain, writes a book at Why the South Should Have Won. It's called A Defense of Virginia, and I encourage you all to read it at some point. It is incredibly well argued, arguing that blacks should be enslaved, that the South was right, and that God was on the side of the South. This is not a lost cause. God really will make it right. This is what my colleague, my faculty colleague, says. God's sentence here pronounced by Noah was based on his foresight of the fact that Ham's posterity, like their father, would be peculiarly degraded in morals, as actual history testifies of them, so far as its voice extends. The words of Noah are not mere prophecy. They are a verdict, a moral sentence pronounced upon conduct by a competent authority, that verdict sanctioned by God. In essence, now if you remember the story, Noah was a drunk guy with a hangover who curses the wrong son. Youngest son didn't know, it was his middle son that but this is competent authority sanctioned by God. God's sanction is never anywhere in the narrative. But the point is that this becomes not just a man making a statement. It becomes God making a statement and legitimating the racial divide in America. There are a number of other texts that are also significant. I wanted to give you one that was a bit of a curveball for you too. This one comes from 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 21 through 27. I encourage you to take a look at this later, just in the interest of time. I know I've probably talked too long so far, and I want to get Julia up here. But this passage is actually a curse on a man named Gehazi, who is the disciple of the prophet Elisha. Gehazi goes out and receives compensation for Elijah's healing of Naaman, a Syrian general who comes to him with leprosy. In response to this, Elisha says, I don't want any compensation, since Gehazi goes and does that seeking to get the money for himself. When he comes back, he is cursed by Elisha. And this is what it says. Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever. So he left his presence leprous as white as snow. Around about the 1840s, a gentleman named William Anderson, an African American, reading this said, hold on now, you want to talk about racial curses in the Bible? Here's one that actually talks about a racial curse that makes people white. And it demonstrates the lack of character of the first person there. How come you guys aren't talking about this as a racial curse in Scripture? We could probably spend some time talking about what this means. Leprous as snow. There's no turn Laban in there. Leprous kasheling. What is it? But the interesting thing is, this actually is in the narrative where the racial dynamics are actually absent in the other narratives that we talked about. African Americans found different ways, so not just Anderson, but many others found different ways of trying to say the Bible can be used in a different way to support the positive and affirmative nature of what we as African Americans think of ourselves to be. Around about the latter part of the 19th century, a movement develops called the Ethiopianist movement. And this movement was basically an effort for African Americans to say, God really was with us throughout slavery, that God had a larger purpose for all that we endured, and that this larger purpose was for us to be a blessing to the world and eventually to be blessed ourselves. In part, this movement was predicated on the interpretation of one passage. This comes from Psalm chapter 68, verse 31, and it's particular to the interpretation of the King James Version of the Bible. Psalm 68:31, princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. This passage, which seems to be relatively innocuous, motivated people like Rufus Perry and Edward Blyden and many other bishops from the AME Church to really buy into this, to suggest that not only should African Americans be lifting up a positive record about the nature of who they are, that God has blessed them, but that they'll go back to Africa and redeem the continent for God further. It was, many people would call this an accommodationist way of looking at the text, but it became incredibly significant. One other way of interpretive piece I want to talk about, I need to read this last piece to you and give you the text associated with. Many people think about African Americans as particularly averse to Pauline thought because of the interpretation of one passage that was read often routinely on Sundays to people who were enslaved. Let me give you the passage first. Ephesians chapter 6 verses 5 through 9 have this following passages. Slave, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling of singleness of heart as you obey Christ, not only while being watched in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Render service with enthusiasm as to the Lord, not to men and women, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are slaves or free. Wonderful passage that lifts up the notion of slavery, that talks about doing this with a cheerful heart, being blessed in the midst of doing this. And this passage was utilized as a framework for talking about why blacks in particular who are enslaved need to be obedient. Aren't you glad I read this whole thing to you? I missed something? What do you mean I missed something? Well, apparently everybody in the 19th century missed this too. And masters, you do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both of you have the same master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality. If I were doing a long class on Bible, I'd say this is part of the household codes. The household codes were meant to be liberative. This was meant to say that those who were enslaved and those who were masters had the same responsibility to each other. But because only the first portion was read, and people ignored the latter part, it was turned into an oppressive paradigm, much like its sister passage, wives, obey your husbands. You ever heard that one? That actually ends by saying, oh, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave his life up for her. Oh, you see the submission there. But because of the way it was read in an oppressive way and became problematic. So Nancy Ambrose, the grandmother of Howard Thurman, brilliant scholar, the mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., says to Howard Thurman, and this is written in his book, during the days of slavery, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slave. Old man McGee was so mean that he would not let a Negro minister, please forgive my typos, a Negro minister preach to his slaves. Always the white minister used as his text something from Paul. At least 3 or 4 times a year he used as a text, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ. Then he would go on to show that it was God's will that we were slaves, and how if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my Maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible. In essence, African Americans, at least according to Nancy Ambrose, were averse to the readings of Paul. That's the better portion of the New Testament, in part because of the way that this had been utilized to frame our oppression in the time of slavery. This is actually so significant. There's a book written by a guy named Amos Jones in 1984 that say, oh, no, black people, you can read Paul. You can actually find some liberating things in it. But this became such a dominant narrative that many people to this day in African American biblical interpretive community still have great difficulty talking about Paul on equal footing with other parts of the canon. Well, this has just been an introduction to what I hope will be a fruitful conversation. Thank you for your time.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm actually going to stay seated because I want to scroll through, and this is a new university computer and it shuts off too quickly for me to actually stand up there because I haven't figured out how to keep the screensaver from popping up. All right, so Rodney and I talked beforehand, and I am building off of what he just presented. So I want you to think of these as not two separate things, but something that is connected. So on June 23rd, 1903, a local newspaper called the New York American wrote of a lynching in Wilmington, Delaware. The gruesome lynching of George White took place after it was alleged that he had raped Helen Bishop, a daughter of a well-known minister of Delaware. According to newspaper accounts, the mob of 5,000 men and women who stormed the jailhouse and summarily burned Smith to death was inspired by the sermon of Reverend Robert A. Elwood, pastor of the Mount Olive Presbyterian Church. And I'm a Presbyterian minister as well as a professor, and it saddens me that Presbyterians are getting such a bad rap.
I'm sorry.
However, Reverend Elwood was 32 years old, a Princeton graduate, my alma mater, right? So we have the same kind of thing going on, and described as a man of advanced views. Despite these accolades, Elwood incited his parishioners with the sermon topic, quote, "Should the murderer of Helen Bishop be lynched?" End of quote. While waving over his head a bloodstained leaves from the thicket in which Helen Bishop was killed, gathered for the purpose by an elder of his church. The sermon Elwood preached that Sunday stirred a mob spirit among his congregation that would eventually erupt 2 days later on the morning of Tuesday, June 23rd, 1903. According to records, the members of Mount Zion Presbyterian Church went away from the meeting livid with passion. And early this morning, according to this quote, the deed was done. I'm not going to go into the butchery of the lynching. It was very gruesome. It was one of the most graphic lynching I've read. What I'm more interested in the Christian context of the lynching. What is striking about this incident is that this lynching was sparked within a Christian context in the midst of a sacred time, Sunday morning service. The question arises of how could Christians so dedicated to the motto of Jesus Christ and the doctrines of Christianity and Christian brotherhood participate in the lynching of Smith? Further, how could a minister of the gospel, one that was supposedly dedicated to the idea that there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ Jesus, how could these people, steeped in the imperatives of the gospel, engage in racial violence? The answer to these questions lie in the processes of what I term racial othering. What which is born out of a fear of the other and a desire to control the other. The process of what I term negative othering is also created out of a sense of identity making, where an individual or group define their identity over against another based off of a learned disgust or threat to their power or status. When race is added to these processes of othering, then a symbolic imagery is placed upon those deemed as a negative other, as in the case of African Americans, people of Jewish descent, and lately those who bear the symbolic markings of Islam. Anti-Semitism, anti-Black terrorism, and Islamophobia all have roots in a kind of negative othering that has been overlaid with racial and religious symbolism. The formation of a racial othering in America has long been a reality in its cultural consciousness. Indeed, the institution of slavery and the subsequent segregationist policies of the Reconstruction era reified this kind of racial other. 40 years before George White was lynched by the Christian community of Wilmington, Delaware, Chief Justice Robert B. Taney argued that the black man had no rights, which a white man was bound to honor. His 1863 decision was published with an attached appendix that noted the arguments of a Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright of New Orleans, a known authority on the subject of humanity at the time. Cartwright's opinion gave scientific, philosophical, and theological backing to Taney's ruling when he described African peoples as brute, half-brute, and, quote, with bodies that were more like monkey tribes and the lower order of animals. End of quote. Cartwright reinforced his arguments with the belief that the blackness of African peoples is embedded in the world's history as Canaanites, Cushites, Ethiopians, and pervades the whole inward man down to the bones themselves, giving the flesh and bones, the membranes, and every organ of the body, except the bones, a darker hue than in the white race. Adding credence to his arguments were the perspectives of local Methodists, who believed that it was an impossibility of civilizing African Americans, and that the Bible was not intended for those inferior races who could not read it. Both Cartwright, Taney, and other Christians were recorded in Taney's document, were persuaded to believe that the, quote, the white man derives his authority to govern the Negro from the great Jehovah, and that Negroes are the people whom God has given him as an inheritance, and their children after them so long as time shall last. End of quote. Clearly, this brand of racial othering was conflated with Christian scriptures and became suffused within the culture of Christianity in America, thereby setting the tone for segregated Sunday mornings for decades to come. What is clear here is that biblical and scientific justifications of African Americans as well as other non-whites were conflated in the minds of many white evangelical Protestants. Fast forward to the 20th century. These beliefs still lie hidden in the unspoken attitude and actions of some evangelical Protestant denominations today. Sunday mornings are still pretty much segregated, despite the rising demographics that people of color outnumber their white Christian counterparts in this country, and that these practices of racial othering are continually found not just in Christian communities, but also in non-Christian traditions as well. Again, this type of negative othering to which I'm referring to continues to be embedded in the context of fear and the pursuit of power over another. In the history of evangelical Protestantism, African and indigenous peoples, what I'm referring to maybe referred to as Native Americans, for example, enter American culture in the larger Protestant church as an already subordinated other. Class and race difference in America helped to shape an ever-evolving American identity, which became more and more conflated with the physical and ethnic identity of Europeans, and specifically white Englishmen. If we have time during our conversation, I'll come back and flesh that out. Thus, the practices of segregating non-white peoples in the basement and balconies of local Protestant churches in America during slavery was implemented on a larger scale outside of the church through Jim Crow legislation. And while the modern civil rights movement eventually dismantled Jim Crow segregation legally, the structures of racial othering remain entrenched within the psychological consciousness of white Americans who were accustomed to the comforts of white privilege and white power. In Christianity, for example, the reality of racial othering even affected the very doctrines of salvation, where African and indigenous people could be freed from sin by accepting Christ as their Savior, yet never fully delivered from white perceptions of their innate depravity, nor their divinely ordained subjectivity. These ideas of a negative racial othering have been passed down consciously and unconsciously from generation to generation and have populated the white evangelical culture of Christianity since the days of slavery. The problem that the Protestant church, like many other religious communities, face, and these communities who continually engage in forms of negative othering, such as racism, sexism, classism, Islamophobia, and any other ism, have all been struck by what scholar Beverly Tannen defines as a paralysis of fear. 20 years after her seminal book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?, many religious communities of various faiths are still crippled by the fear of engaging in dialogue with the ever-growing numbers of people of color in their communities, who they have historically, and many not so historically, deemed as a negative other. As Tannen Wright quotes, "Fear is a powerful emotion, one that immobilizes, traps words in our throats, and steals our tongues. What do we fear? Isolation from friends and family, ostracism from speaking of things that generate discomfort, loss of privilege or status for speaking in support of those who have been marginalized by our society, or physical harm caused by the irrational wrath of those who would disagree." It was out of the fear that the religious communities within American Protestantism determined that it was easier to create separate institutions within the faith as opposed to truly embracing the true tenets of their Christian doctrine. While the creation of segregated Sundays was really about the maintenance of white privilege, power, and status, today, those of us who were born or who are born into the America's racial landscape, regardless of ethnicity or category of racialization, are suffering from this same type of negative othering. White people are damaged by the cycle of racism, though in ways less obvious, just like people of color. We are all suffering, which means that the job of overcoming racism belongs to us. The means of healing the divide in our country over this issue of racial and religious othering, whether it be in the form of anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, or Islamophobia, lie in conversations about race and the effects of racism across race, class, and gender lines. For religious communities, especially predominantly white Christian communities, it is time to talk about implicit bias, white privilege, and racial othering within their own faith communities. There is a need for a self-interrogation and a need for substantive conversations with those who have borne the brunt of racial othering and inequality. In short, we need to hear the stories from those we have been unconsciously and consciously objectified and who are seen solely through the lens of the media. For some of us, the task of hearing stories from those we do not think like, or who don't think like us, who don't look like us, who don't act like us, will require a leap over your own fears. For others, this step will require you to think about race for the first time. Both steps are crucial. For when we hear the stories of the other, especially those we have historically defined as a negative other, it opens the process of humanization and awakens our consciousness to the destructive legacies of negative othering that we have allowed to exist within our cultures, within our religious communities, and the larger society. For far too long, many people within their respective religious communities have only entertained one story or the other. And typically that story has been disseminated through racial and religious stereotypes, again, branded through social media. It's amazing what you can read on Facebook and Instagram. So what does a conversation look like when we decide to hear the story of one who we have deemed as a negative other? I had the chance to see this image when I taught an LBST class last year. LBST classes are liberal studies classes, and you can talk about different types of realities in the Western Hemisphere. So I taught this course, My students were given the assignment to read Tannum's book and relate her arguments to a life event. I had a racially mixed class. It was wonderful. I usually have racially mixed classes, but this particular class I had students from all over the world, which is just awesome. One particular presentation ended with a dialogue between two self-identified Muslim students, one from Pakistan and the other one from Saudi Arabia. The Muslim student from Pakistan shared his stories of discrimination that he and his community had faced from Muslims born in Saudi Arabia. As the presentation came to a close, there was an exchange, possibly for the first time, between the two Muslim students, both of whom were willing to hear the other's story about the racial othering they had experienced in their respective faith communities. I could tell that each student, though within the same faith, was hearing a new perspective of the other and getting a more humanized view of each other. The experience was also eye-opening for the other students in my course, who consisted of a few atheists, a couple of Christians, and one or two agnostics. As the conversation came to a close, other students expressed surprise at the discrimination each Muslim student had experienced in their own countries among people of their own faith. Some students even admitted that they had preconceived notions about their Muslim classmates, and those notions had been disrupted as they experienced the conversation. The stories shared between these two Muslim students that day were so much more than a teaching moment. It was a humanizing moment for them and each other, and as well as the rest of us in class, which is ultimately the first step in removing the burdens of racism in our country. Thank you.
All right, so I'll start with a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to all of you. So Dr. Sadler?
Yes.
Dr. Robinson Moore spoke about what religious institutions and communities can do today, how they contribute to racism today, and how they can work to dismantle racism today. So could you offer some things that the religious community can and should do? And then we'll move to the non-religious community.
Excellent. I think one of the first things that the religious community can do is to acknowledge, that it has a complex history of involvement. If you look at the appendix to Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative life of Frederick Douglass, he spends a good deal of time talking about the fact that there are two notions of Christianity in America, one of which he calls the Christianity of Christ, and the other which he calls the slave-holding religion. And these two, he says, are the furthest things from each other. To believe the one is true is to believe the other is completely false. In essence, we have to recognize that Christianity has often been complicit in the perpetuation of racism. He goes on in that statement to talk about the fact that the church bell and the slave auctioneer's bell chime in time with each other. In essence, that the church offers a thin veneer to cover the gross atrocities of slavery. We've got to begin to recognize that we have a very dangerous history in place in the Christian church in particular. In addition to recognizing this horrible history that's in place, we have to recognize that the churches that we worship in today are often the descendants of the theology that fueled that sense of church back in the 18th, 19th century. We often have uncritiqued theological positions that we don't recognize are perpetuating the same type of things today. I can give you an example of this. It will probably be an unpopular example, but if we think about the way that we have interpreted Paul's notion of grace within the church as the antithesis of work, grace versus work. In part, the way that grace has functioned in our context has been a way of saying that it doesn't really matter what you do. As long as you say the right things, as long as you believe the right things, then you can get a free ticket to heaven. So you can be a slaveholder, you can rape your enslaved women, you can have a slave ship and kidnap people and bring them across the ocean. You can do all sorts of evil. But you said the right things, you prayed the right prayers, you sang the right songs, you're getting into heaven. We need to examine the nature of the way our theology continues to have considerable problems in it. And we need to begin to do this now. We can't continue to let this perpetuate. I think that if we begin to also reread our scriptures, I'm a big biblical guy, we need to begin to reread our scriptures and recognize there's great hope in them. These texts have been read in a way that has been wholly problematic, but we can also find great strength. So one of the things that Julia just referenced was the passage from Galatians chapter 3, verses 27 through 28, that basically says that in Christ there's no longer Jew nor Gentile, there's no longer enslaved nor free, there's no longer male and female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. This was meant to be incredibly liberative and foster new modes of identifying people in Christ. How do we begin to redeem passages like that, utilize them in a way that might prove useful in today's context? And how do we actually juxtapose that with notions of race? So, for example, to say things like, if this is true about Christianity, it is fundamentally impossible to be a racialist, i.e. believe that race is legitimate, and to be a Christian. So I'll leave that as a good starting place.
And the religiously unaffiliated in the room, what is their role?
You want me to start with-
Yeah, because a good portion of those in America don't identify as having faith.
So I ended my talk talking about the ways in which we need to just have conversations with each other. So it doesn't have to be in a religious context. You can just choose to have a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you, doesn't have the same kind of ethnicity that you do, and just ask them their story of experiencing everyday life. Ask them what are their stories of discrimination or racism. And just in hearing that story, number one, it humanizes people that the media has taught you to say, oh, those people over there. And number two, it gets you in dialogue, because the thing about racism is that it can operate consciously and unconsciously. And sometimes we can operate in what I call a default mechanism, where we will just automatically go back to what we've heard our parents say, or people in our families, or what media says. But when you are actually talking and dialoguing with people, you begin to break down those things. A case in point was my first time being called, not indirectly, a NIGGER, was I was friends with a white couple. And I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I love ginger ale. And they were coming back from Michigan to bring me some ginger ale, and they said when they stopped, they had ran into some niggers. And they're saying this to me. And I realized that in their dialogue, because we had shared each other's stories, because we had talked, but we hadn't really talked about race, they thought, well, I was the exception to the rule. And so now we had to have a conversation about race. And so there are many times that we are in workplaces and we are interacting with people who are of a different ethnicity, but we are not talking about race. And we're not talking about racism. And so to be brave enough to talk about race in the workplace, in the school, in the street, you don't need a religious background to do that. You just need to make a decision to reach out to people and share their stories.
Amen. And I'll follow up with that. A wonderful way of engaging people that are different. We have a program with MECMEN that we've called the Friday Friends model. In essence, what that is find somebody that's very different from you, race, ethnicity, gender, orientation, covenant to meet with them for about 6 months, and then as you begin to develop a friendship, ask each other indelicate questions. Begin to go down deep until finally you find that person, and you get through your stereotypes and learn who they are, develop a friendship, and maybe even get your families together later. It's a great way to begin to delve, to sort of cross that chasm across difference and begin to see who people are. But one thing I will say is that please don't ever think that we can stop by just trying to develop good relationships with others. We have to begin to recognize too that race is a larger systemic issue, and the way that racism works in America is often through structures in our society that have nothing to do with individual opinions or modes of thought, but that shape the way that we think. So we need to begin to also think, how do we begin to dismantle or to deconstruct that larger ideology of race and racial identity, and how do we begin to critique and examine understand those structures in our society that perpetuate it. Until we begin to do that, we really are only scratching the surface.
So I was going to wait till the end for this question that I ask every presenter, but since you brought it up, addressing systemic issues. We talk a lot in Charlotte. We're really good at that. After the protest, McMahon had weeks and weeks of conversations, but we are ready to act and make change. And we want to find some systemic issues where we can pick up the piece of the puzzle and make a difference. So on a local, state, and national level, what are the most critical issues that you think we should be addressing?
Golly, there's so many.
That's okay, listen. Okay.
Mass incarceration.
Amen.
The prison system is built off of imprisoning majority people of color, and especially African Americans. Towns are built based on the production of a new prison system. There's a test that third graders have to take, and there's articles out there that saying that those third graders who don't pass that test are projected out to how many prisons need to be built in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's one. And that's a huge one. There's a way in which, so prejudice is, discrimination against people just individually, but racism is prejudice and race based on a system of advantage. There needs to be more dialogue and conversations at the state and local level about how racism operates as a system. Economically, politically, even geographically. The rezoning and the redistricting of schools and neighborhoods are another area that we need to look at. So I'll just leave it at that. I know Rodney can add on.
Well, thank you for the question. I think one of the things I'd say is that, and maybe this isn't popular, because I think most people want to hear, well, we need to address police violence against African American men. We need to address black on black violence. We need to address lack of education. We need to address health care. We need to address chronic poverty and the persistence of it along racial lines. And I'll say all of those are wonderful things, but I think they're fundamentally symptoms of a much deeper problem. I think the fundamental issue for us is that we need to begin to address the way that the concept of race itself makes it impossible to live as equals in this society. So we are a people of a chronic bifurcation in our minds. We are people at the same time who say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You remember that statement? Isn't that who we say we are? But at the same time, we hold up the notion that, no, we're actually different races, and different races are hierarchically related, and we can say, because of the color of your skin, I can tell you about your intelligence, your life expectancy, your sexuality, your criminality. I can make all of these wonderful statements about who you are based upon racial identity. In essence, this is a irreconcilable bifurcation. We are living in a state of cognitive dissonance if we believe that we can hold these two ideas at the same time. We need to begin to reconcile that, recognize that the concept of race itself has to be weeded out of our society before we're ever to actually get to make any significant progress. And one of the things that, dare I say, that Judy and I have worked on for a while now is how do we begin to have a truth and reconciliation kind of process that might begin to address these kinds of issues.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to add is the reason why I chose negative othering is because to say something is racist has so much loaded language that you really can't get to the root. And if you think about positive othering versus negative othering, then you're really getting at the root of it, because we all differentiate between each other in positive ways. We all know that we don't look alike and we're not the same people. But when we put a negativity on that othering, now you get some of the structures that are creating racism. And so I'm trying, just as a scholar, to even use different language, different wording to talk about the processes by which people differentiate themselves in a very negative, pejorative kinds of way. And so we need more thinkers just even about the very language by which we talk about difference in who we are.
Amen.
So.
We had a very heated session for those of you who were at Johnson C. Smith, and there was a question of removing all the boxes that define us on the census. And one of the presenters felt like, well, we can't overcome some of the issues that we have, the inequities, if we remove all those boxes on the census, right? So would you be in favor of trying to remove those right now, or waiting till we can overcome some of the inequities and create some restorative justice?
I had a wonderful conversation with anthropologist from Duke, Lee Baker, when I was working on my dissertation, because I talked about moving beyond race. And he was quite concerned that I was moving to a quote-unquote colorblind kind of concept and suggesting that, you're just going to get rid of these things and everything will be fine. And I said, no, that's not the point. The point is to recognize the ideological problem associated with the concept of race. And one of the things he raised as a concern to me was, in part, we have to retain some way of identifying people along quote-unquote racial lines, if not to show what the impact, the disparate impact has been on them in society. If we get rid of all these notions now, how do we tell who's not surviving, not doing well, not thriving in society? One of the responses I've had to him is to begin to reimagine these notions of the way that we've identified ourselves, and perhaps get beyond the concept of race, but define ourselves in terms of quote-unquote communities of condition. What I mean by that is, how does the larger world respond to you because of how you look on the outside? This has nothing to do with who you are ontologically, genetically, biologically, but it has something to do with the way that the social structures relate to you. This might be an interesting way of addressing that problem. So people who are responded to in a negative way by the larger society because of the color of their skin, we might be able to track them in that way, even as we begin to move beyond racial markers to identify them.
We open it up to all of you.
Do I understand what you're saying is that this racial, what I think I'm hearing you say is that through the use of the Bible and its interpretation by others, that this racial divide is anchored subliminally with the Bible and its teachings. So I'm sitting here thinking to myself, how in the world do these two incredibly brilliant people embrace the Bible when it's the anchor for such a great source of pain that you've experienced?
Well, I'm also a great lover of science, and science was used to much the same ends. And I think the point is that just about anything you have can be used for either good or for evil. I still hold the Bible quite dearly and relish the opportunity to delve into it and interpret it, and sometimes even to do a quote-unquote corrective historiography and the corrective hermeneutic in my way of reading it that will show where we've gone astray and where we might find more promising ways of reading it going forward. So I don't think that we need to give up the Bible completely. A lot of people will suggest that. I don't think we have to give up Christianity completely, but I do think that we all need to look at things with a hermeneutic of suspicion. And we need to be circumspect as we interpret the text. I often tell people in my class that the Bible is an incredibly dangerous book. It should not be read by children, and it should not be read lightly. My second little thesis is this: any way that you read the text that lifts you up high enough to put your foot on someone else's neck is a wrong-headed reading.
In terms of how I understand it, I'm always looking at the ways in which culture becomes a lens by which we look at the biblical scripture. So I'm a professor here at UNC Charlotte, but I'm also an ordained Presbyterian minister. And the reason why I got into religious studies is because I was fascinated by the lenses or the pair of glasses that culture puts upon communities by which they approach the text. So for me, there's never been per se anything wrong with the message of the gospel or the message of the Old Testament or the Torah or the scriptures themselves, but there's always been something wrong by which the culture attempts to appropriate Scripture in order to justify its own ends and means.
Amen.
So I had never heard of the curse of Ham until about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I was devastated to think that this text from the Torah could be used to oppress. So it's about the interpretation, not the text itself. Though there are parts in the text that are oppressive themselves,
Yes.
And
right?
that's something
We're looking at race, the way
Yeah.
race is.
I mean, I often say that about the Genesis 9 passage, that passage, there are often two loci for problems in the text. The original interpretation of the author's intent and the history of interpretation. The Genesis 9 passage, I think, is problematic in both loci. I think its original intent to discriminate against the Canaanite people was wholly problematic, and I think that any text that can be read in that way can also be read. So I often call it the curse of X. You pay your money, you take your choice on who you want to. I mean, it might be today African Americans, tomorrow Native American Indians, later on South Africans, Black South Africans. So pay your money, you take your choice on who you want to condemn.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm interested in your assessment of what percentage, or I don't know how you would state it, of predominantly white Christian congregations are understanding what was done with the Bible to justify, and are amenable to coming around and seeing it differently. And how might those that may be borderline be persuaded to be educated and understand it this way? Is that
Well,
answer the question?
I don't have a certain percentage per se. I want to say that mainline Protestant denominations who have historically been predominantly white and have not reached out to sort of integrate their congregations are born into racism is like a smog. Like, I just came back from California, and if you've been to Hollywood or whatever, there's this sort of smog that there. So if you're born into a church family that has always been predominantly white and has never brought up the issue of race, then that's your norm. And so there's a way in which these communities have to be awakened, number one, to their own whiteness, to understand what it means to be white and privileged, and then to have conversations about that. And I would say that the mainline denominations throughout the United States, who have historically, they might be 100 years old, or they might have 5 or 6 generations back, they are unaware, and if they're unaware, then they may be even choosing to stay unaware. So for example, my work looks at churches who own the descendants of African American churches. And nobody, so the literature is there, the research is there, the documentation is there, but nobody in the predominantly white churches wants to talk about it unless it's going to be brought up into, their face.
There's not very many, huh?
Okay.
Last year, I visited 50 churches in 52 weeks. And about a third of the churches I visited were predominantly African American or historically African American. And I went through and looked at what I did, and about a third of the churches that I visited were what I would say integrated. In other words, Dr. King's statement was, and that was, a pleasant surprise for me. But none of the churches that I visited that were integrated were historically African American. I was always the only white person there. And I just wonder if you would address that.
First of all, I mean,
And I was always welcome,
interesting.
but I was always the only white person. Now,
Interesting.
depends on which ones I chose.
Yeah, and I think that definitely is a matter of choice too. I think I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever been the member of a black church that did not have a few non-black members. And that seems to be normative, because the black church has always been premised on a fact of universalism. All God's children are welcome, all God's children can participate. The problem often is that whites don't want to worship in black spaces. We feel it's inferior. Worship styles are problematic, the singing, you guys worship too long. All of those things that sort of sound like, they really sound like nitpicky things on the surface. But if you get beneath that, you'll realize there's a notion that blackness is fundamentally inferior, and we don't want to associate ourselves with inferiority. So I think that there's a large part of that. It's not that black churches don't want white members, it's that white people often don't want to worship in black spaces. I've had some friends who've actually made that choice, particularly when I was in the church I was in Mount Level in Durham. White people who left a white Baptist congregation intentionally to come worship there. Dr. Mike Broadway teaches at Shaw University, Larry and Nancy Baumgardner, who made this choice, raised their families in this context, and it was an amazing transformative experience for them, and I hope that they write a book sometime to talk about what that means. Now, one of the things I'd want to say too is that the fact that we have quote-unquote black churches and white churches has nothing to do with whether or not the styles of worship are one way or another. It has to do with historic decisions that were made to limit the power of African Americans in congregations that were run by whites. So one of the congregations that Julia talked about, First Presbyterian Church uptown, one of the things that I discovered by doing a class between First Presbyterian and First United is that First Presbyterian and First United aren't two separate churches. They're the same church. It's just that the black folk weren't allowed to lead in that and were forced to leave the church and have to start what became two other churches, Brooklyn and what's the other church? Seventh Street. And then they eventually come back together to make First United. In essence, blacks were kicked out of the white church. A racial decision divided the Christian family. And that history still lingers. We have to, at some point in time, deal with that history before true reconciliation is possible. Supposedly now, there are of all Protestant churches, only about 5% fit what we would call interracial congregations, i.e. more than 20% of some other racial dynamic exists. So we've got a long way to go. In some respects, the Jewish community is well ahead of us. The Muslim community is well ahead of us.
That made a face like
well, some of them. I wish. We can talk about what some of those reasons might be as well. But we've got a long way to go as Protestants. The Catholic community is well ahead of us. So, yeah.
I made a face just because our congregation is not as diverse as we'd like it to be. So we are welcoming and embracing, but in Israel's incredibly diverse,
yes.
But not in America. So we are growing 6% of Jews, I think, are people of color.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of sitting with the whole concept of negative othering versus positive othering, which kind of zeroes in on something I've been wrestling with for a while, and I'm not sure I can ask this in a way that's clear or sounds very bright. But going way back decades to college days and classes that I took, I think it's accurate to say that virtually all societies, primitive, evolved, do negative othering.
Absolutely.
That's always where people go. And it makes me feel very hopeless that there would be any way really to move past this struggle, because it seems, whether it's based on color or size or beliefs, or if you just think about all the different societies and cultures that we know of, there's always a hierarchy built in. I don't know where we go with that.
Absolutely. To 2 points. I am wrestling with the idea that the roots of racism actually started between ethnicities of the same type. I could look at the history of between the Catholics and the Protestants, or I could look between the Irish and the British, and I could say, okay, the same types of markings, the same types of trappings of negative othering are there. I'm still fleshing that out in terms of my research. The second point I want to say is that there are always pockets of resistance that can be incredibly transformative. Dr. Martin Luther King and those who engaged in the modern civil rights movement were pockets of resistance that actually eventually transformed this country. So even though the tide seems overwhelming, when you have enough people of like-mindedness get together and strategize, they can start a wave. Now, you might not totally eradicate it, but as a person born in the late 60s, early 70s, I'm so glad that Martin Luther King started the pocket of resistance, because I don't know whether I'd be here. I understand it can be overwhelming, but I don't want us to devalue the power that are in those, the remnant, that small group of people that can start a spark and begin to change things. So.
What we should, both of you could explore a little more. We both touched on the false construct of race and what that's done, and the need to get past it, but also in order to get past it, to educate everybody in the process. So how do we proceed with a conversation about race without perpetuating the discussion of race? Because words matter. And if so many of the community that really we need to reach and talk to aren't here, and aren't going to listen.
Yes.
And if we continue to talk about the classifications of race in an effort to educate, that's what's going to get heard, and it cements it. You both were touching on it. I'd like to expound, or if you could expound a little more, because I think that's where the conversation needs to go. So we can have those genuine conversations that are people-based, and we get rid of the nonsense that is so plaguing us. It's not a question, it's an urging to kind of...
I 100% agree with you. I think that you're right. There is a quandary that's there. But the two things I'll say. The first thing is that race it's a synthetic idea that came together at a particular point in time to serve particular purposes. It was manufactured to achieve a goal. If we created it, we can deconstruct it and reimagine a different way of relating before then. So, for example, whiteness is something that was manufactured. What is whiteness? Why does whiteness exist? Well, because you have a nation that consists of a bunch of people from the warring tribes of Europe, and we want them all to get along. So we can't have you coming here and calling yourself British, and you calling yourself Irish, and you calling yourself French, and you calling yourself German, because these people hate each other. They've been fighting together for 2,000 years. So what we'll do is we'll call you all, well, you guys are all white. And now your identity is no longer juxtaposed to each other. It's now juxtaposed to black people. And we've got a new enemy that's described. It's an intentional choice that made at a particular point in time. And literally, we have to begin to understand that we have the power to reshape what race is. And we can begin to reimagine it. So one of the first things I might suggest is that one thing that we can do right now to begin to change the future is put an anti-racial understanding in the curriculum of our schools. If you can begin to train kids at 3rd grade level, at the 8th grade level, at the 10th grade level, and at the 12th grade level, ways that work against racialist thought, you might have the ability over the next 20, 30 years to make a significant shift in society. One of the things I'll point out is, many people said, 15 years ago, that we would never have, quote unquote, LGBTQ marriage. It's just not where we are as people, where our in the span of about 15 years, we started seeing different images on television. We started seeing people intentionally making shifts. If we can do it with that issue, which was thought to be immovable, we can begin to do it with race too. We just have to have the collective will to do so.
Would an aspect, because I'm struggling as well.
Oh no, certainly.
Would an aspect of it, because you said at the beginning, racism was an economic construct. How to excuse, how do you take?
Yes.
So if the conversation, if we focus on the additional part of the conversation on the economic disparity, I mean, one of the issues in the American Civil War was the incredibly low percentage of white plantation owners that actually owned slaves is a very small number. They were able to convince everybody else to go and die for their benefit,
Yes.
their economic benefit.
Yes.
And maybe part of the conversation is around some of the economic disparities that we have, which are much more common over a much wider spectrum.
So if you want me to tell you why do we still have race functioning today, I will tell you the reason we still have race functioning today is it serves the economic interest of the top 1%, because race is a way of making sure that poor white folk don't realize that their economic interests are much more closely tied to those of black folk than they are to rich white folk. So race has a very definitive purpose in our current status quo, and in terms of maintaining it. That's why it continues even to this day.
And also, it's a way to keep those groups locked into the labor class, right? Because the 1% need a cheap labor class to continue on with their other kinds of agendas.
All right. Do you want to continue? No.
Yeah, I just had one more thing. In a dream world, I would love to do this in every class. I don't have enough money and funds to do it. I would love to have the first week of class, my students take a DNA test from Ancestry.com or wherever, and then see their actual genetic makeup and all the different kinds of continents that make up who they are. And I think if we can implement something like that, people would grow up with a whole new sense of who they are.
Amen.
Where, to your comment, that how similar we are.
That's right.
The level of the percentage of differences is virtually not.
That's right.
It's also non-existent, yeah.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. So you guys are going to have to fight out the question over there. So we'll take one in the back, and then they're getting married in 2 weeks, so they're going to see who wins this. All right, combine your 2 questions, right? Okay.
Hello, doctor. As a clinical social worker and a therapist who works frequently with adolescents and pre-college age teens, you mentioned getting it, incorporating programs into curriculum into the schools to start those real, tangible conversations and to help facilitate that change. Because honestly, in sessions, I see a lot of that negative othering coming out as different things that's affecting the kids and the young adults I'm working with. What are some resources that you may know of that would come address that adolescent pre-college age? Because all of the stuff I'm hearing is making my clinical tail fluffy. I love it. But I'm trying to think what are some resources that would be accommodating, or at least on the level of pre-college, high school age, even middle school age students that I work with that I can incorporate into, say, therapy sessions.
That's a hard question that you asked.
Yes.
And I don't know that I've got a lot of great answers. There are a lot of simple books that delve deeply into complex issues. One book might be a book by Dave Unander called Understanding Racism, I believe it's called. Do you know this book?
I can't remember.
It's a book that's written by a Christian who's also a geneticist. And he spends time trying that people could read that would give you a good background on it. There are a number of exhibits and movies that might be easier. So Race, the Power of an Illusion would be a good one. Traces of the Trade might give people another understanding of the way that race and slavery have been tied together. What's another good movie? If you really want to deal with a good one that will scare the heck out of anybody, 13th.
Yeah. There's a film that I use, but it can totally be shown to teens. It's called Ethnic Notions, and that it's very good, and it gives a lot of visuals in that. I want to go back to Beverly Tanum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Because in her appendix, she has a number of resources that you can look at, but she also has a number of activities. She has 12 or 12 to 17 activities that can certainly be applicable to young people in a variety of settings as well. But that's an excellent question.
So in the interest of time, because I realize how late it is, he's just got an announcement. I'll address you guys later.
Oh, good. No, you can do it. If he just has an announcement, you go for your question. And
Okay, I'll make it quick then. In our society, we have very little class consciousness. And it's so, what we were mentioning earlier is how intricately it really is tied in this idea of racism and the idea that there's actual scarcity, if there is actual scarcity, and the idea of hierarchy. How do we kind of raise up the idea of a class consciousness in tandem with these discussions about race and racism?
I think one of the first ways is as we destructure or de-define, if there's such a word, racism, we have to talk about class. We have to talk about economic inequities, because what racism to me has always been a smokescreen over other inequities that are on the ground. And once we get into dialogue about destructuring and de-defining racism, then we'll actually get to the root of classism, economic equalities, political equalities, because these are the things. So for example, as Rodney said, many people from different European backgrounds were put into the same box. So there's been this process of de-ethnization of people. Well, that de-ethnization of people was, again, an economic thing in order to get people's minds off of the economic inequalities, right? And this is why during the progressive movement, you had labor and unions had such a hard time getting together, is because people were now paying attention to economic equalities. Dr. Martin Luther King said, oh, wait a minute, well, race is important, but now I need to really work with class and poverty. So he goes to the garbage workers. So I think once we begin these conversations, then we can dig down and do that.
I just wanted a couple of things that, especially you, Dr. Rob, said, made me think of a couple of things just to announce or shout out. And one of them is on your comment about if we all did DNA analyses, we'd be surprised at how similar we are and dissimilar from people who we think we look like. Mm-hmm. If you Google up American Anthropologists Association statement on race, mm-hmm. you'll find it was from about 98 or 99. It's growing. It's about 3-page explanation of that. It sounds very nice to say that there's only one race, which is the human race, but it's also completely true. And so anyway, that's excellent. And also, Reverend Sandler mentioned the power of an illusion. I think was if you Google PBS race power of an illusion, I think it was called. Mm-hmm. They also have an excellent. It's accompanied with an excellent series of short articles by people like George Frederickson and Audrey Smedley and Robin D.G. Kelly. Mm-hmm. So that's a great source. And I use the short articles in my classes and so on.
I'll put these in the email. I'll put these resources in the
Good. And there's a wonderful article, just picking up on that, that accompanied that statement on race. There's a whole edition of the American Anthropologist that really does, Audrey Smedley's in it, Alan Templeton have some incredible articles that really do a great job of dismantling that concept.
And then also a book that came out a year, I mean there's a million books on all this stuff, but a book that got a lot of attention published 1 year ago called Stamped from the Beginning by a fellow named Ibram Kendi is wonderful. And Tim Tyson is from Duke. Anyone who lives in the state of North Carolina should read everything that Timothy Tyson has written.
He's a great guy, and he makes great barbecue too, supposedly.
Yeah.
Any final words that you want to say before we?
Well, the one thing I would say is that race, Dr. King's, my favorite word from Dr. King, or progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability, but comes about by the tireless efforts and persistent work of those willing to be co-workers with God. We have work to do. This issue will not go away on its own, but we have the power to overcome this if we work together on it.
I guess my last thoughts are a conversation I had with my students a couple of weeks ago, where I was talking about the power of passive racism. And it's a racism where you hear a racial slur or you see something going on, but you just sit quietly and make the argument that passive racism is more deadlier than the overt alt-right or Ku Klux Klan that's waving the flag. So I just encourage you to, whenever you see it or whenever you know people who are operating in passive racism, to say, hey, you know, it's all of our problems that we have to overcome.
Amen.
So.
I have one quick question. Do you know who wrote the song, Jesus Loves the Little Children, all the children of the world? Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight. I learned that when I was 6, but by my grandmother, but I don't think her church fully.
So just in closing, it struck me that our two presenters are not only professors, but they are people of faith. So a prophet's role is to speak truth to power, to see and articulate the painful realities that plague our world. And the prophet's role is also to bring comfort. And the fact that the two of you are professors who are also preachers and people of faith, you've been for your students and for all of us truly prophetic voices, and we thank you.
Thank you very much. And the name of that text, Shattering the Myth of Race by Dave Unander. There you go. Sorry about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.